He tore the land from her hands while her children watched. She had nothing left, not even the ground beneath her feet. The king laughed as his soldiers dragged her to the border, but in her hands she clutched a small bag of seeds and a silence that felt like a promise. No one knew that those seeds would one day grow into a throne. The morning it happened was the kind of morning that tricks you. The sky was pale gold, soft and warm, the kind of sky that makes you believe the world is gentle. Birds called to each other across the millet fields. Children laughed somewhere behind mud walls. The air smelled of red earth in the first cool breath of the dry season, that brief, sacred window before the sun becomes a punishment. It was in this beautiful, lying morning that King Darius rode into the village of Canodara with 30 soldiers behind him and hunger in his eyes. Not hunger for food. Hunger for more. His horse was black and enormous, fitted with a saddle of red leather that cost more than any family in Canodara would earn in a generation. The soldiers wore iron and moved like a wall. The villagers scattered, children pressed themselves against doorways. Old men looked at the ground because they knew what it meant when the king came personally. It meant something was about to be taken. At the edge of the village, beside the oldest baobab tree in the region, there was a plot of land that did not look like much. It was small, perhaps the size of 4 rooms pressed together. The soil was dark and carefully turned, not because the rains had been generous, but because someone had worked it every day with love so fierce it became a kind of prayer. That land belonged to a woman named Grace. Grace was 43 years old. Her husband, Elias, had died 4 years earlier of a fever that no healer could name, leaving her with 3 children and a debt that the village council had quietly forgiven out of respect for the man Elias had been. Since then, Grace had done what women like her have always done in the face of impossible odds she had endured. She had worked. She had risen before the sun and laid down after it. She had fed her children on less than they needed and told them it was enough. Her land was her only inheritance, her only asset, her only future. And King Darius wanted it. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us from where you are watching from us. To understand why Darius wanted a poor widow's small plot of land, you must first understand what kind of man King Darius was and what kind of king he had become. He had not always been this way. There are people in the kingdom who still remembered the young Darius, the prince who used to walk through the market without guards, who used to eat groundnut soup with the traders and listen to their complaints with real ears. Those people were older now, and they spoke of that young man the way you speak of someone who died with fondness and with grief. What had replaced that young man was something else entirely. Darius ruled the kingdom of Karanda from a palace built on a hill, so that he could always look down on everything he owned. And he owned a great deal. The palace had 40 rooms filled with imported furniture and foreign paintings. His treasury was stocked with gold collected from taxes that grew heavier every season. He kept 3 hunting estates, a personal army of 200 soldiers, and a council of 7 advisors whose primary function was to agree with him. He was 51 years old. He had been king for 19 years. And somewhere in those 19 years, the desire for more had replaced every other desire he had ever had. More land, more gold, more power, more control. It was his advisor, a cold-eyed man named Harrison, who first pointed to Grace's plot. The widow's land sits exactly where the new road must pass, Harrison had said one evening, spreading a rolled map across the council table. If we build the road through the village as planned, we avoid her plot and lose 2 weeks of construction time. If we move the widow, we gain a direct route, and the road connects the eastern mines to the capital in 11 days instead of 15. Move her where? Another advisor had asked. Harrison had shrugged. One small shrugged. Elsewhere. Darius had looked at the map for a long time. His finger had traced the line of the proposed road. His eyes had not shown conflict. They had shown calculation. Do it, he had said. Grace had received no warning, no letter, no notice from the council, no messenger with an offer of fair payment or reception. She had woken one ordinary morning to the sound of hooves and the sight of 30 soldiers standing in her millet field. Her eldest child, a boy of 16 named Samuel, had stepped forward. His fists had been clenched. His jaw had been set with a bravery that was also terror. "This is our land," Samuel had said. "It belonged to our father." A soldier had shoved him back. Samuel had stumbled. Grace had caught her son, and then the king himself had dismounted. Darius had stood in Grace's field with his red leather saddle glinting in the morning sun, and he had looked at her the way a man looks at an inconvenience. Not with cruelty exactly, with indifference. Which was worse. "You are occupying land that belongs to the crown," he said. "I have papers," Grace said. Her voice was steady. This was remarkable. Even the soldiers noticed. "My husband was granted this land by your father's council 20 years ago. I have the document." "My father is dead," Darius said. "His grants are under review." "Under review?" Grace stared at him. "My children eat from this land." "Then find other land," Darius said. He turned back to his horse. "Where?" Grace asked. She said it quietly, not begging. Asking. A genuine question from a woman who needed a genuine answer. Darius did not turn around. "That is not my concern." They gave her 1 hour. 1 hour to collect whatever she could carry and leave the only home her children had ever known. The soldiers stood at the edges of the field while Grace moved through her small house with the mechanical calm of someone whose mind has not yet accepted what is happening to their body. She took a blanket, 3 changes of clothing for each child, a clay pot, a cooking knife, the document her husband's land grant, which she folded carefully and placed against her chest, inside her dress, next to her skin. She took the photograph of Elias that hung above the sleeping mat. She took the seeds. The seeds were in a small cloth bag, tied at the top with a cord her mother had braided. Inside were varieties that Grace had been collecting and cultivating for 11 years. Drought-resistant, a red bean that could fix nitrogen in dry soil, a type of sorghum that her mother's mother had brought from the north, and 3 other varieties that existed, as far as Grace knew, nowhere else in the kingdom. She had been developing them, saving them, improving them, season by season, with the careful patience of someone who understood that survival is not luck, it is preparation. When she walked out of the house for the last time, Samuel was standing in the field with his younger sisters, 12-year-old Mercy and 9-year-old Abina. Mercy was crying silently. Abina had not understood yet and was watching the soldiers with wide, curious eyes. Grace looked at her children. She looked at the baobab tree behind the house. The one she had played under as a girl. The one Elias had carved their initials into on the day they were married. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned her face toward the road and began to walk. She did not look back. A soldier called after her, something dismissive, something designed to humiliate. She did not respond. Grace walked with her children in a straight line, her head level, her back straight, her hand pressed against her chest where the land document pressed back. King Darius watched them go from on top of his horse. Harrison appeared at his side. "Good," the advisor said quietly. "The construction crew can begin clearing next week." Darius said nothing. Something moved across his face, too fast to identify. It might have been doubt. It might have been something older and more uncomfortable than doubt, but it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the flat, efficient expression of a man who has decided not to feel things. "Send word to the mine foreman," he said. "The road moves forward." "Yes, Your Majesty." They rode away. The dust from the king's horses settled slowly. It took a long time. The red dust of Kenodara always settled slowly, as though the earth itself was reluctant to let things go. An old woman named Nanakosi, who sold dried fish at the edge of the market and who had known Grace since she was a girl, watched the whole thing from behind her stall. She had not moved during the soldier's visit. She had stood very still, her arms folded, her lips pressed together, watching Grace walk away with those children and that small bag of seeds. After the soldiers were gone, Nanakosi looked down at the ground. She whispered something. It was not a curse. The old woman did not deal in curses. It was a prediction. "The earth remembers what it gives," she said to no one in particular, "and it remembers who it takes from." Grace walked for 3 days. She had a destination. A cousin's family in the neighboring territory of Sand, 200 kilometers east of Karenda's border. The cousin's name was Ruth. They had not spoken in 6 years. There was no guarantee Ruth would welcome them. There was no guarantee of anything, but east was the only direction that made sense, because east was away, and away was the only thing Grace had been offered. They walked on roads that turned to paths that turned to nothing. They slept under trees. Samuel hunted small birds with a sling he made from a strip of cloth. Mercy learned to start a fire from a piece of flint she found in a dry riverbed. Abina stopped being curious about soldiers and started being curious about stars, asking her mother the names of constellations that Grace had half forgotten and made up the missing half for. On the third day, they crossed into Sand. The territory of Sand was technically part of the same regional federation as, but it operated under a different administration, a council of village elders rather than a single king, and it felt different the moment. You crossed the invisible line. The air smelled the same. The trees were the same. The red soil was the same, but there were no soldiers on the roads. The people who passed nodded to strangers instead of looking through them, and the markets, when Grace and her children finally reached the town of Tend, were loud and alive in a way that felt like permission to exist. Ruth opened her door and did not hesitate. "You look terrible," Ruth said, looking at Grace. "I have seeds," Grace said. Ruth blinked. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." This was how it began. Ruth's compound was small. 3 rooms and a courtyard shared with a neighbor. It was crowded with Grace's arrival, but Ruth made room the way people who have grown up without excess make room. Not by creating space, but by deciding that everyone matters enough to share the space that exists. Grace slept on a mat on the floor beside her children for the first 2 weeks. She did not waste those weeks. Within a month of arriving in Tend, Grace had spoken to every farmer in the surrounding area. She had visited the dry western plots where the rains came late and left early, where the soil was thin and stubborn, where families planted their crops and watched them fail year after year with the resigned repetition of people who have learned not to be surprised by loss. She asked questions. She listened. She looked at the soil with her hands, pressing it, lifting it to her nose, tasting it on the tip of her finger. She walked the land at dawn to read where the water moved. She sat with old men who had farmed the same plots for 50 years and asked them what they remembered about the seasons their fathers had described, and then she opened her cloth bag. The first season she planted on a borrowed quarter-acre at the edge of Tend. The elders came to watch her work with the skepticism reserved for people who promise more than experience suggests is possible. They watched her plant the drought-resistant millet in shallow rows, watched her intercrop it with the red Dutrin-fixing bean, watched her water it sparingly and precisely in the early morning hours, when evaporation was lowest. They said nothing. When the harvest came in that first season, full, dense, abundant in a year when every other plot in the area had yielded only half a crop, the elders stopped watching and started asking. Grace taught. This was the thing about Grace that the king of Karanda had not considered. When he took her land, he had taken her home but left her knowledge. And knowledge is the only thing that cannot be confiscated. She taught the farmers of Tend how to read soil moisture by the color of the earth at different times of day. She taught them the intercropping system that maintained soil fertility without expensive inputs. She taught them seed selection, how to identify, season by season, the plants most adapted to local conditions, how to save those seeds, how to build a living library of genetic resilience that deepened with every generation, and she taught them for free. In the second year, 12 families were using her methods. In the third year, 40. In the fourth year, the Tend Agricultural Cooperative formally adopted her system and appointed Grace as their head advisor. The yield reports that went to the regional council were extraordinary. Officials came from the capital to see what was happening. Agricultural experts came from 3 neighboring territories. What they found was a woman in a faded blue dress, standing in a field, showing a young farmer how to assess soil drainage by the growth pattern of a particular weed. Back in Karanda, the King's Road was built. It was a fine road, wide and well-packed, connecting the eastern mines to the capital in 11 days as Harrison had promised. For the first 2 years, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It moved, or faster. It increased production. It filled the treasury with the additional revenue that Darius's calculation had anticipated. But roads have consequences that calculations do not always capture. The road brought faster extraction. Faster extraction meant deeper mining. Deeper mining broke the water table in 3 eastern villages that had relied on wells for generations. Those villages lost their water supply in the 3rd year. Without water, they could not farm. Without farming, they had no food. With no food, people left. Not all at once. People never leave. All at once. They leave in 1s and 2s, quietly, like water draining through a crack, and by the time you notice the crack, most of the water is already gone. The eastern villages emptied slowly over 4 years. Darius's council noticed the tax revenue dropping from the eastern region. Harrison produced reports explaining the shortfall in various ways. Poor rainfall, aging infrastructure, population movement. The reports were detailed and confident. Darius read them and accepted their conclusions, because the conclusions did not require him to change anything. Meanwhile, the mining operations expanded westward. The western expansion cut through 3 more farming communities. 2 of them held protests, organized gatherings of families who brought their land documents and their grievances to the regional administrative office. The soldiers dispersed both protests. Harrison drafted new regulations clarifying that mining rights superseded farming rights in designated development zones. The 3rd community did not protest. They simply left. By the 7th year, Kuranda had a problem it could no longer explain away. The kingdom's agricultural output, which had already been declining as marginal farming land was absorbed into the mining development zones, dropped by 40% in a single season. The cause was not drought. The cause was not pests. The cause was that there were simply fewer farmers farming, fewer hands in fewer fields, less knowledge maintained and passed down, fewer seeds saved and reaped, less of the 10,000 daily decisions that make the difference between a living soil and a dead one. The famine came quietly, the way famines always come, not as a sudden catastrophe but as a gradual tightening. A season of hunger, followed by another, the granaries, declining fraction by fraction, the markets offering less and less until the stalls stood half empty and the prices of what remained climbed beyond what ordinary families could pay. In the palace on the hill, Darius ate well. His personal supply chain was insulated from the crisis his policies had created. His council reassured him. Harrison drafted more reports, but the people of Kuranda were eating less. And then they were eating much less. And then some of them were not eating at all. On the 7th anniversary of her exile, Grace sat outside Ruth's compound. She had her own compound now. 3 rooms she had built herself with neighbors' help, surrounded by a garden that was as much a demonstration as it was a kitchen, and watched the sun go down over the hills of sand. Samuel was 23 now. He managed the seed bank that Grace had established, a proper building now, clay walls and a cool interior, holding over 300 seed varieties from across the region. Mercy was 19 and studying plant biology with a scholar who had come from the capital specifically because of the work being done in Tend. Abina was 16 and teaching other children how to read, something she had learned from a neighbor's daughter in those early years and had never stopped doing. Grace held the cloth bag of seeds. On her lap, the original ones. She kept them still, though she had replicated them many times over. She thought about the baobab tree. She thought about Elias. She thought about what the king had taken, and then she thought about what had grown from what she had kept. It was Mercy who brought her the news from across the border. "People are coming," Mercy said one morning, sitting down across from her mother with the particular serious expression she reserved for important information. "From Kuranda, not a few. Families. They're crossing the border at the northern pass. The Elders' Council has been receiving them." Grace looked at her daughter. "How many?" 30 families so far, more every week." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "Are they farmers?" "Most of them, they say the land is failing. The mines are taking the water. The harvests are gone." Grace stood up. She pressed her hands against her thighs. A habit she had when she was thinking hard about something. The texture of the cloth, slightly rough, grounded her. "Take me to meet them," she said. The families from Kuranda camped at the northern edge of Tend, in temporary shelters the community had erected to receive them. Grace walked through the camp with Mercy, stopping at each family, asking questions, listening. The stories were different in their specifics and identical in their architecture. Land taken, water lost, crops failed, nothing left to stay for. One man, a farmer named Joseph, 60 years old, with the slow, careful movements of someone whose body has been used hard for decades, recognized Grace. He stopped when he saw her face. He stared. "You are Elias's wife?" he said. "From Kano Darayam," Grace said. Joseph sat down heavily on a log. "Then you know how it started. Tell me how it continued," Grace said. Joseph told her everything. The road, the mines, the water table, the villages, the protests that the soldiers dispersed, the regulations that Harrison had drafted, the families that left, the famine that was tightening its hands around the kingdom's throat, the granaries that were three-quarters empty, the people in the capital who were now standing in lines for food that the palace distributed not out of generosity, but to maintain order, to prevent the desperation from becoming something louder. He told her about the night 2 weeks ago when a group of farmers from 3 villages had gathered in secret and decided to leave rather than watch their children starve, how they had crossed the border at dawn before the soldiers changed shift. "Is the king aware of the severity?" Grace asked. Joseph's face changed. A particular expression, not contempt, not anger. Something more exhausted than either. "He is aware that people are complaining," Joseph said. "His advisor tells him it is a temporary adjustment." Grace nodded slowly. "Harrison?" she said. Joseph looked at her. "You know him?" "I know the kind of man he is," she said. "I have met him before." She did not say more. Over the following weeks, as more families crossed the border, Grace began to piece together a picture that was worse than she had imagined. She had understood that Darius's greed had caused damage. What she had not understood was the systematic nature of it. It was not simply that the king had been careless. It was that Harrison had built a machine designed to extract maximum value from the kingdom's resources in minimum time, with no mechanism for preservation, restoration, or accountability. The mines did not replant. The roads did not maintain. The development zones did not protect. The regulations did not ask what would remain after the extraction was complete. There had been agricultural advisors who raised concerns. She learned this from a young woman, a farmer's daughter who had briefly worked in the capital and overheard conversations in the administrative offices. Those advisors had been dismissed. Their reports had been filed and not acted upon. Harrison had ensured that the only information reaching the king was information that confirmed the value of what was being taken. Never. The final piece came from a merchant who traded between Sand and Karanda, a man who carried information as readily as he carried goods because he understood that information was often worth more. He told Grace about the granary reports, the real ones, not the ones Harrison presented to the council. The real reports showed that Karanda had perhaps one more season before the public food distribution collapsed entirely. After that, there would be no mechanism left to prevent the crisis from becoming catastrophic. "How many people?" Grace asked quietly. "500,000, the merchant said. "That is, who will go hungry if nothing changes?" Grace felt the weight of that number settle into her chest like a stone placed carefully in still water. 500,000 people. She looked at her cloth bag of seeds on the table between them. Then she looked up at the merchant. "Who is currently the head of the Regional Federation Council?" she asked. The merchant raised an eyebrow. "Elder Amara. She is based in the eastern capital. She is known to be a reasonable woman." He paused. "Why?" Grace picked up the bag of seeds. She turned it over in her hands once. "Because," she said, "it is time to have a conversation." The Regional Federation Council convened in an extraordinary session 3 weeks later. Elder Amara had agreed to the meeting quickly, more quickly than Grace had expected. The reason became clear when Grace arrived at the eastern capital and was told, quietly, by one of the elder's assistants, that the council had already been receiving alarming reports about several neighboring territories had raised concerns about the flood of displaced families crossing their borders. 2 trading partners had suspended agreements with Karanda, citing instability. The crisis had been visible to everyone except, apparently, the king. Grace sat before the council of 7 elders, 4 women, 3 men, ranging in age from 40 to ancient, and told them what she knew. She told it plainly, without drama, in the careful, organized way of someone who has spent 7 years learning how to make complex things understood by people who need to make decisions. The room was quiet when she finished. Elder Amara leaned forward. She was a small woman, gray-haired, with eyes that had the particular quality of people who have heard many things and been surprised by very few of them. "You are recommending," she said slowly, "that the council intervene directly in Coranda's governance." "I am recommending," Grace said, "that the council fulfill its mandate. The Federation exists to ensure the welfare of all territories. 500,000 people face a food crisis created by policy decisions, not peanut. That is exactly the situation the Federation was created to address. And you believe you can help resolve the agricultural component?" "Yes," Grace said. Simply. Without qualification, Elder Amara looked at her for a long moment. "You were exiled from Coranda." "I was," Grace said. "Does that create a problem for you, returning?" Grace looked at the elder steadily. "I am not interested in returning to be recognized. I am interested in returning because there are people there who need what I know, and what I know can help them. After that, I will go back to tend and continue my work." Elder Amara sat back. She exchanged a look with the elder beside her. A long, speaking look. "Tend sighed. We will send a delegation to King Darius. You will come with us as an agricultural advisor." "He will not receive me," Grace said. "He will receive the Federation Council," Amara said. "And you will come with us." A small pause. "Bring your seeds." The delegation arrived at the Coranda Palace on a Tuesday, in the dry season heat, with 12 council representatives, a full written mandate from the Federation, and one woman in a faded blue dress carrying a cloth bag. Darius received them in his great hall, a room designed to overwhelm, with high ceilings painted in gold, enormous hanging tapestries, and a throne raised on a platform so that whoever sat on it looked down on everyone who stood before it. Harrison stood to the king's right. As always, Grace stood in the middle of the delegation and looked at the room. Then she looked at the man on the throne. He had aged more than 7 years should account for. There was something in his face. Not wisdom, not exactly, but a kind of erosion, as though the weight of the thing he had been doing had worn something away in him. Harrison saw her first, his face so carefully neutral through 11 years of practice at showing nothing did something small and involuntary. A tightening, a flicker of recognition that he immediately suppressed. But Grace saw it. Elder Amara presented the Federation's mandate, a formal review of Coranda's governance under the crisis provision of the Federation Charter, which allowed external oversight when a member territory's internal policies created regional destabilization. Darius's jaw tightened visibly. "This is my kingdom," he said, "and the 4,000 families who have crossed into neighboring territories in the past year are our responsibility." Elder Amara replied, without heat, "The Federation Charter is clear. We are here in accordance with the law." Silence. Then Darius looked at the delegation more carefully. His eyes found Grace. He did not recognize her immediately. She was 7 years older. She was dressed differently. Not better, but differently, with the particular bearing of someone who has arrived somewhere rather than someone who is waiting. She stood differently. She held herself differently. Then recognition arrived. Slowly, then all at once. His expression did not change on the surface, but something behind his eyes, something deep and uncomfortable, shifted. "You," he said. "Your Majesty," Grace said. Her voice was even. She did not bow. The Federation Council members did not bow either, because the Charter was clear about the equality of standing during oversight proceedings. This was the first time in 19 years that anyone had stood before Darius in his great hall without lowering their head. Harrison stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the woman in the delegation is a known agitator. She was removed from Coranda for defying royal authority." "She was removed from Coranda," Elder Amara said, "for occupying land that was lawfully hers, as documented in records now in the Federation's possession." She placed a folder on the table between the delegations, the land grant issued by the previous king, the witness testimonies from the village of Kano, Dara, and the complete agricultural assessment reports that were prepared for your Majesty's Council between years 2 and 5 of the mining expansion, reports which, according to the advisors who prepared them, were never delivered to the king. The room changed temperature. Everyone felt it. Darius turned to Harrison. The movement was slow, deliberate. "What reports?" he said. Harrison's face did not move. There were preliminary assessments that were determined to be what reports. Darius said again, quieter this time. The quietness of a man realizing something. Harrison said nothing. "The reports," Elder Amara said, "showed that the mining expansion, if continued without environmental mitigation, would destroy the water table in 9 villages. They recommended a modified approach. Those reports were filed and classified by your advisor. You were never shown them." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has mass, the kind you can feel pressing against your ribs. Darius stood from his throne slowly. He walked down from the platform 3 steps, each one deliberate, each one bringing him to the same level as the people standing before him, which was something that had not happened in this room in many years. He walked to the table. He opened the folder. He looked at the reports. He turned pages for a long time. No one spoke. When Darius finally looked up, he looked first at Harrison. The look lasted a long time. Harrison held it. He was a man who had held difficult looks for 19 years and survived them. But something in this look was different. This look contained information Harrison had not seen in Darius's eyes before, the particular clarity of a man who has stopped being willfully blind. "Get out of my sight," Darius said to Harrison. Harrison opened his mouth. "Get out." Harrison left. Then Darius turned to Grace. He stood before her, the king and the widow, in the enormous golden hall, with its high-painted ceiling and its tapestries and its overwhelming scale, designed to make ordinary people feel small. Grace did not feel small. She looked at him and waited. "You lost your land because of a road I built," Darius said. "It was not a question. I lost my land because you decided your road was worth more than my family," Grace said. "Those are different things." Darius held her gaze. A muscle moved in his jaw. "And yet, you have come back." "I came back for the 500,000 people in this kingdom who are going to go hungry," Grace said. "Not for you." Something crossed Darius's face. It was complicated and uncomfortable, and looked, for a moment, like the beginning of shame. "You could have let them suffer," he said. "You had cause." "I am not interested in causes for suffering," Grace said. "I am interested in ending it." A pause. "That is the difference between us." The room breathed. If this story is moving you, please subscribe, click the bell. The ending of the story will change how you see everything. "What do you need?" Darius said. The question was quiet. It was possibly the most genuinely humble thing he had said in 19 years. Grace looked at him for one more moment. Then she opened her cloth bag and set it on the table between them. "Time," she said. "Farmers, and for you to get out of the way." The Federation Council formally assumed joint oversight of Coranda's agricultural recovery. Harrison was investigated and removed from his position pending a full review of the withheld reports and the decisions made based on falsified information. 3 additional advisors who had participated in the suppression were the mining operations in the 9 eastern villages were halted. Environmental specialists from the Federation's technical office began the long, difficult work of assessing the water table damage and identifying what could be removed. Some of the damage was permanent. Grace had known it might be. She had not let that stop her from coming. What Grace could fix, she fixed. She returned to tend twice a month, bringing farmers. She had trained 31 of them in the first year, organized into teams that spread across Coranda's agricultural regions the way water spreads across a field after rain, finding every place that was parched and offering what it needed. She brought the seeds, not just from her bag from the seed bank that Samuel now managed, 300 varieties that represented decades of careful human observation and preservation. She taught the farmers of Coranda the way she had taught the farmers of Tend, without condescension, without rushing, with the profound respect of someone who understands that knowledge given freely multiplies in ways that knowledge sold never does. The first harvest under the new program was modest. Grace had told them it would be modest. and explained why soil that has been neglected does not recover in one season, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But it was a harvest. It was enough to extend the public supply through the next season, which bought time for the next harvest, which was better. The granaries began, slowly, to fill. 6 months after the Federation delegation's arrival in Kuranda, Grace was walking through the fields of Kanodara. The region had been part of the recovery program. New farming cooperatives had organized here. Young people were learning seed selection, soil management, intercropping methods. The land around the village, even the land where the road ran, the land that had been taken from Grace and her children and paved over and built upon, was being farmed along its edges with varieties that could tolerate the compacted soil near the road surface. She stopped at the baobab tree. It was still there. Enormous. Ancient. Indifferent to everything that small human lives had done around it. The initials that Elias had carved were still visible in the bark, slightly stretched by the tree's growth over the years, as though the tree was slowly, gently making the inscription its own. Grace pressed her palm flat against the bark. The bark was warm from the morning sun. Rough, solid in the way that things are solid, when they have been standing in one place for centuries. She closed her eyes. She heard Mercy's voice behind her. "Mama." Mercy was standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression that Grace recognized it was the face of a daughter watching. Her mother feels something that cannot be spoken. "Are you all right?" Mercy asked. Grace looked at the tree, then at her daughter, then at the field beyond, new green growth in careful rows, the work of hands that had come here from Tend, that had learned from Grace what Grace had learned from 11 years of watching and listening and refusing to let grief be the final word. "Your father would have liked this," Grace said. "He would have been very proud," Mercy said. Grace nodded once. She took her hand from the bark. "Let's get back to work," she said. The formal assembly of the Regional Federation, the meeting at which Kuranda's governance structure would be permanently revised under the new Federation oversight framework, was held in the eastern capital for months later. Elder Amara presided. The representatives of 12 territories were seated in a circle, which was how the Federation conducted its most important business, in a circle, so that no seat was higher than any other. Grace was seated at the circle as Tend's agricultural representative, a formal position she had accepted reluctantly and held with complete commitment. She sat between Elder Amara and a young environmental engineer from the Northern Territory, and she listened as the restructuring of Kuranda was debated and decided. What emerged was not a simple transfer of power. It was a new framework. Kuranda would be governed by a joint council. The king, who retained his role with reduced authority and significant accountability requirements, and a People's Council of regional representatives elected by the communities most affected by the previous policies. The People's Council would hold veto power over any decision affecting land use, water rights, or agricultural policy. The first chair of the People's Council, voted in by unanimous decision of the community representatives, was a woman named Grace. Darius sat in the great hall of his palace that evening, alone. For the first time in a long time, truly alone, and held the folder of suppressed reports in his hands. He had read them many times now. He could recite the findings from memory. He did not need to read them again. He held them anyway. He was thinking about the morning he had ridden into Kanodara. The pale gold sky. The woman in the field with her back straight and her head level and a cloth bag tied to her wrist. He was thinking about the moment she had asked him, "Where?" and he had said, "That is not my concern." He put the folder down on the table. He pressed his hands flat against the surface and looked at them. His hands, which had signed the orders and received the reports that were not delivered and eaten well, while 500,000 people went hungry. "I had everything," he said to the empty room. No one answered, and I understood nothing. 1 year passed, then another, and in the way that time has of quietly healing what cruelty has damaged, never perfectly, never without scar, but persistently, the kingdom of Kuranda began to breathe again. The granaries held enough by the 2nd year. By the 3rd year, they held more than enough. The surplus was managed by the People's Council with a policy that Grace had proposed. A portion of every year's surplus would be kept as a reserve against future failure, and a portion would be shared with neighboring territories facing shortage. Not sold. Shared. This was not universally popular. There were merchants who would have preferred the surplus go to market. There were advisors, new advisors now, but advisors nonetheless, who worried about setting a precedent. Grace heard these concerns patiently and proceeded anyway. Samuel ran the Federation's regional seed bank network, now a system of 12 interconnected banks across 6 territories, each holding hundreds of varieties, each connected to the others through a rotation protocol that kept the genetic diversity alive and growing. He was 30 years old and spoke about soil biology with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing something long enough to know it deeply. He had his father's eyes and his mother's patience. Mercy completed her agricultural science studies and returned to tend. Then to Kuranda, working with the communities whose water tables had been damaged to develop farming systems that could function with reduced groundwater access. She had written 2 papers that were being read by scholars in 3 countries. She was 26, and she spoke in public with the particular fearlessness of a woman who watched a mother walk away from soldiers without looking back. Abina was teaching school in Kanodera. She had established the village's first proper school building, 3 rooms, clay walls, a courtyard with a mango tree in the center, funded partly by the People's Council and partly by donations from 20 families who had crossed the border during the famine years and come back when the land was green again. She was 23, and she laughed easily and often, which Grice considered the greatest success of all. Harrison was tried before the Federation's Accountability Tribunal and found responsible for the suppression of material information that had directly contributed to the kingdom's agricultural collapse. He was stripped of his titles. His accumulated assets were placed in a remediation fund for the affected villages, and he was barred permanently from any administrative position in any Federation territory. He lived in a small house at the edge of a town no one had heard of, and if anyone asked him what he had done for work, he gave a vague answer and looked at his shoes. Darius was still king. This had surprised some people. It had not surprised Grace. "He needs to repair what he damaged," she had said simply, when Elder Amara raised the question of his fate. A king who leaves does not do that. A king who stays, if he stays with accountability, can be part of the restoration. That is more useful than the alternative. What Darius had not expected, what no one who had known him as the king on the elevated throne had expected, was how seriously he took the accountability requirements. He attended the People's Council sessions without complaint. He read every report now. Every one, with the particular intensity of a man who had learned at significant cost what happens when you choose not to look at the full truth. He had fired his entire advisory council and rebuilt it with people whose job description included, explicitly, telling him what he did not want to hear. He was not a transformed man in the way of stories, where transformation is complete and clean. He was something more believable. A damaged man doing the hard, daily work of becoming less damaged. Grace, for her part, did not forgive easily or quickly. Forgiveness was not something she thought about very much. What she thought about was the work in front of her, which was always enough to fill every available hour. She had a new house in Tend, a proper one, built of brick, with a courtyard garden that served simultaneously as her kitchen, her laboratory, her classroom, and her thinking place. She also maintained a room in Kano Dara, in the village where she had been born, and from which she had been exiled, because she believed in the irreplaceable value of roots. She was 50 years old. She rose before the sun. She laid down after it. Some things do not change because they do not need to. On the morning of the 3rd anniversary of the People's Council's formation, Grace walked out of her house in Kanodara before the rest of the village was awake. The sky was pale gold. The air smelled of red earth and the first cool breath of the dry season. Birds called to each other across the millet fields. It was the same sky it had always been, the same earth, the same birds. But the fields were full. She stood for a long time and looked at them. The careful rows of green, the quiet industry of growing things, the evidence of 10,000 daily decisions made by human hands that had learned to read the land and care for it and trust it. She pressed her palm against the baobab tree. The bark was warm, rough, solid. She thought about the small cloth bag she still kept on the table beside her sleeping mat. The original seeds, still there. She would never plant them. Not these ones. These ones were memory. These ones were proof. Proof that what is taken from you cannot take from you the thing you know. Proof that seeds planted in strange soil by determined hands will grow. Proof that the woman who walks away with her back straight and her head level and a small bag of what matters most is not defeated. She is only beginning. The baobab tree stood above her, enormous, ancient, indifferent to kings and councils and the small, urgent dramas of human ambition. It had seen a great deal, it had outlasted a great deal, and carved into its bark, in letters slightly stretched and softened by decades of growth, were two initials that a young man had pressed into the wood on the day he married a woman he loved. Grace traced them with her finger. Then she turned her face toward the field and walked into the morning light, because there was work to do. And she had never once in her life been the kind of woman who lets the sunrise wait, the man who had everything finally understood what everything cost, the woman who had nothing understood from the very beginning what everything was worth. And the seeds she carried out of exile, those ordinary, extraordinary seeds, became the harvest that fed a kingdom, the foundation of a council, the curriculum of a school, and the quiet proof that the earth remembers what it gives, and it remembers who it takes from. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it moved you, if it stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Grace and her seeds and the way she walked out of that field with her head up, then share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Baobab Stories and click the bell so you never miss a story. Every story we tell is for you. Watch our next story here.